welcome to Daily Debrief from People's Dispatch. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Samarkand has concluded and throws up some interesting results. And we'll talk about media reports which say that 4 NGOs and some rich corporations got all the power but no accountability during the COVID-19 pandemic. The outcome, $10 billion thrown at various projects, most of which failed. All this in the week's final episode of Daily Debrief. In our first story, the 2-day Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting concluded in Samarkand on Friday with a declaration. The SCO is a unique grouping with some of the largest and most populous countries which are growing rapidly and becoming the engines of the global economy. What are its priorities and what is its future? We have with us Prabir Purkayastha. Prabir, lots of conversation around Iran joining the SCO being called a momentous occasion. Can you start by sort of telling us what is the importance of the SCO and Iran joining?
Well, the SCO was always on the radar, but it had somehow sort of gone a little bit in the background. And we had what would be called the Indo-Pacific orientation, earlier Quad, then we had the AUKUS Treaty.
Right.
Again, it was supposed to be Australia. I don't know why UK comes into this, it's so far away. But nevertheless, Australia and the United States. And already there is a Japan alignment with the United States. So this is really more about Southeast Asia, possibly. Shanghai Cooperation Organization has existed for some time. India has been a part of it, so has Pakistan. But it was also looked upon as something which builds a bridge between Russia and China.
Right.
And it's more an economic set of relationships that is being sought to be fostered. For China, it is also in some sense a complement to what would be called the Bridge Road Initiative. So
Right.
that's the trade routes and the trade between within the Eurasian landmass. Of course, it also extends to Africa and Latin America through the seas. So this is the background of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In some sense, it's radically different from the other geostrategic groupings that exist. One is, of course, the G7, what I always have called in this show as a settler, colonial and ex-colonial powers coming together. And in some sense, they are the, shall we say, the successors of the colonial regimes that ruled the world,
Right.
say 70 years back. So that's really the white man's club, as I think a New Statesman article called them. So that is the other grouping which is there, whose military arm is the NATO. That's the part, and Japan is very much, of course, a part of the G7, but also implicitly a part of the NATO by being in virtue of a military partner of the United States. So this is the Shanghai background to the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. It was seen initially as really Central Asia, East Asia, and of course Russia coming together.
Right.
And then extended to South Asia with India and Pakistan also joining in. And now, as you have rightly said, Iran has also joined the SCO. Now, the difference between an SCO kind of coming together, that it is not competitive, it's not really competing with each other, it's not a competitive organization. In
Right.
the sense, it's not competing with other similar groups, it's really talking about what is it that we can do with each other. If we look at NATO, for example, it is also power projection, military power projection using the oceans.
Right.
And it can do so because oceans are open, so trade across oceans is controlled by who has more naval power. And of course, using the Navy to control the shores. That was the power, that's how the colonial regimes emerged, 16th to 20th century. But this has been, the Silk Route has to be there for a cooperative engagement, because this is not possible when you're looking at land-based trade. So I think there has been a different understanding of how the SCO can bring countries together. And with Iran now coming in, we see for the first time a West Asian alignment also emerging. Will it force other West Asian countries to join? We have to see.
Right.
That because India and Pakistan compete with each other. They're not willing to even have trade across. In fact, Modi has asked that all SCO countries should allow transit.
Indeed,
So,
yes.
And that's essentially an argument that Pakistan should allow transit to India to be able to trade to Central Asia. So this is something that can be worked out within the SCO orbit. And I think it's important that if countries in SCO try get together, it might build a larger cooperation, not just competition, unlike what we see with NATO, which is really at the moment trying to impose its power or its will on Russia as well as China.
Now, Prabir, you mentioned India. Now, the announcement about Iran actually came during the at the eve of the SCO summit, where there were, all the partners were there, all the members of this SCO were there, and India seems to be trying to warm up to, they say, China. It's playing a certain role with vis-a-vis Russia. What are India's plans over here?
Well, that's a big question, because India has also said on the Ukraine issue, it's also said it wants the Ukraine war perhaps to stop, which of course is good wishes, what everybody wants to say. The question is in whose terms. That's the only discussion that is there, because Russia has said, give us guarantees Ukraine won't join NATO. Donbas region autonomy is what they were asking for. I think that has now gone. And the independence for the Donbas region, there's a possibility that there could be an agreement. We don't know. But the issue really is, what is India's role in this? I think the fact that India had such a high-level representation in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization means that India gives a lot more importance to it today than maybe it did 2, 3, 4 years back. So I think that's an important, what shall we say, visible sign of what could be happening in the future. China still remains a fraught issue, because the border issue is not settled. Let's be very clear. Now, northern border is something which will stand in the way of good relations with China, even though economic relations continue.
Right.
So that is still to be seen how it plays out. It's very clear India will not break its relations with Russia over Ukraine, partly because the military ties are old and they are necessary for India. Otherwise, the cost of American or Western arms probably will be much more than what Indian economy can bear. We already have seen with the Rafale deal the cost that is involved. But also India needs oil from Russia and also fertilizers, etc. from Russia. So it's very unlikely that India will accept the G7 demand that it is used as a lever against Russia.
Right.
So it does seem that India is not going to accept the sanctions that are sought to be imposed on Russia, and also it is trying to see how it can buy Russian oil using other currencies, including the ruble or the rupee. So if all of this is taken into account, it's a cautious return of India, I would say, to the Eurasian landmass where it belongs, and is no longer looking at Indo-Pacific, which the Quad was that, but that expression, and the Quad essentially is no longer a major element in all of this, because if you see the map, that the US interest is East Asia and Southeast Asia, and India doesn't figure in too much in any of these regions. India's role in Southeast Asia could have been more if it had joined the RCEP, which it didn't, the trade bloc. Right. And therefore, unfortunately for India, the Southeast Asia looks to China much more for trade than it does to India. So given that, I think it's a cautious return to West Asia, Central Asia for India, and of course relationship with Russia, already has a relationship with China, I think is perhaps the best course for India. Of course, India is also keeping its options open vis-a-vis the United States, and we know that. But how far, which way it will go, I think India is going to try and play both sides at this moment, depending on what suits its interest.
All right, Prabir, thanks very much for joining us. Who should get COVID-19 vaccines first? Who should pay for them? Should drug patents be relaxed? What drugs work, which don't? Where should vaccines go first? An expose on how the rich countries handle the pandemic by Politico and German newspaper Welt has proved health activists got the answers to these questions right. But the world still mostly got it wrong. Wealthy corporations and large philanthrocapitalists from the wealthiest nations took over making healthcare decisions for the whole world, and everybody suffered. Economies tanked, healthcare collapsed, millions died. Let's go over to Gargia from People's Health Movement. Right, Gagia, thanks for joining us. Gagia, the Politico Wealth expose is making a lot of revelations about what happened during the pandemic. Can you just sort of give us in a nutshell what are the most important findings of this news report?
Uh, this report actually is coming almost 2 years after the pandemic has started and the efforts for solving the pandemic have started. And the four organizations in question here are the Gates Foundation, CEPI, which is a coalition against diseases, uh, the Welcome, and then Gavi. So these are four large organizations, predominantly, large private sector organizations, philanthrocapitalists in their nature. And these organizations have been at the forefront of the response for COVID. And in some ways, from the very start, they have been a face of the response. But what's been, from the very start itself, we have been having a lot of problems with these organizations. And it kind of, in the start, we really did not have enough evidence that it was all looking very opaque and there wasn't enough accountability from these organizations. And now, increasingly, we see there is this evidence and evidence coming through. And this Politico expose is one of the things. And this actually, the expose says a few important things that one of the main ones is these organizations together actually spent around $10 billion on COVID and its response. And they collectively kind of, took over the role of the World Health Organization. And to an extent, they have been at the forefront of the response. And what they did by doing this is kind of they have not addressed the key systemic problems that have been faced. Like, for example, when we talk about vaccines, the tests, the medicines, and so on for COVID, we have seen that they have not really addressed the key issues of local manufacturing, patents, and other corporate barriers that come with them. So they have not really addressed those systemic barriers. They have kind of done a piecemeal solution to what we have in front of us. And what by this they have also done is they've actually failed in doing that, even in the mainstream managerial or corporate world also. They have not really addressed or they have achieved their own goals and their own benchmarks. So they are a failure in providing equity, but they're also a failure in their own, reaching their own goals. For example, they told by end of 2021, we are going to give 2 billion vaccine doses, and they could not reach even 1 billion. I think the report does comment that only 900 million were reached. And the same thing with the COVID-related testing, and the same with COVID-related therapeutics, we call medicines and therapeutics. So these organizations kind of failed on, rising to the occasion, and they actually overtook the whole responsibilities of the governments and creating a systemic thing. And the other thing is also that there has been a lot of, I wouldn't say corruption exactly, but kind of revolving doors of organizations and a lot of lobbying that was done. For example, a lot with the EU and US representatives. There has been kind of, a lot of lobbying that they have done to solidify their role. And this kind of comes out in this expose.
Right, Gagesh. So there were actually repeated warnings from the health activists around the world who were saying that the governments need to cooperate in order to solve the problems related to the pandemic, that the countries which need the vaccines most should get the vaccines. But that obviously didn't happen. So what is the role that these companies, these organizations played, which sort of, did they help or did they hurt this process of equity? How did they actually operate?
So one of the main things here is these are very technocratic organizations when you look at them. Is their intention basically to create harm is not exactly what it is. But the kind of understanding they have, very technocratic, and the understanding that vaccines or some of these things are magic bullets that will solve the issues. For example, in the report they say about there is this particular thing that governments and health systems of the governments need to be strong enough, and the exposure really shows also that they really did not bother about these things, that there should be enough adequate health facilities, health systems, and functioning health systems on the ground. So what has happened is the intentions they might be having are kind of might be good, or I wouldn't say might be good also. They have their own understanding because they come with a lot of clout of money. They have good relationship with pharma companies and so on and so forth. So what they have hurt is actually by not having or not allowing for a systemic solution to this, and they have also really not worked on these regular issues of austerity, of weak health systems and so on. So this is something that we have been facing from many years, that these philanthrocapitalists, these large organizations, and these all together formed something known as ACT Accelerator, which was the and COVAX facility, which were supposed to manufacture and provide the vaccines and all the related medical products. But what they did was this became like a large public-private partnership. So what basically happened is something that needs to have been headed by the United Nations and the World Health Organization in a spirit of solidarity and multilateralism, became a multi-stakeholder platform. We call this ACT Accelerator as a mega PPP because it's so big and so on. So these mega PPPs, we are kind of coming to know right now that they have failed and they are unable to rise up to the occasion. We gave a benefit of doubt that it's a pandemic and everybody should work together. And the evidence increasingly shows that we have failed, these large PPPs have failed in both providing the necessary things and doing an equitable distribution of the same. So this particular expose again shows, kind of reiterates the same, but also brings about the role of Gates Foundation in particular, and these large organizations in global health, which we have always been pointing out that they come with their own understanding, conflict of interest, and technocratic view of the issues at hand.
By technocratic understanding, do you mean to say that they felt that if there is a capacity to manufacture and contracts are given out to make the vaccines, then the distribution would take care of itself? Was that one of their assumptions?
I mean, even in their own understanding, for example, having one facility in India manufacturing for everyone and from there distributing itself also was not a great idea. So they didn't really come up with, multiple places where they were manufacturing and so on. Now later they kind of opened a small hub in South Africa saying we are going to manufacture mRNA vaccines and so on. And we are actually still more than two and a half years into the pandemic. We still see that African countries are still at 20 to some of them are at 20 to 30% of vaccine coverage. And the failure actually has its roots in this kind of colonial understanding of still that something is manufactured and then sent to these countries there by flight or something, and the charity model of it, that we donate vaccines, we donate medicines for you. So this side of top bottom understanding of health has led us to this miserable situation. Sorry.
All right, Gagya, thanks a lot for joining us. And that's all we have for today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us on Monday. And for more such stories, visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.